He is a writer, a lawyer, an activist, and my favorite term, serial entrepreneur. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, which you all have a copy of, Let There Be Water, Israel's Solution for a Water-Starved World. His essays on water and other issues have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and leading publications in Europe and Asia. He has spoken on water issues around the world and at venues in more than 40 US cities, including the United Nations, Davos, Google's headquarters, and at more than a dozen major college campuses, including Princeton, Yale, Stanford, and now finally Cal Poly. Seth is co-founder of several companies, including Beanstalk, the world's leading trademark brand extension company, which he sold to Ford Motor Company. He was also a producer of the Tony Award-nominated Broadway revival of Man of La Mancha. Seth sits on the board of several not-for-profit organizations. In addition, he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And get this kicker before I introduce him. All the profits on the sales of the book are donated to nonprofits. So this is obviously a labor of love as much as anything for Seth. So please put your hands together and welcome our author, Seth Siegel.
I have to confess, Adam, I did not want you to stop. I wanted you to keep going. It's not often that someone who was introducing me has actually read my book. In fact, it's usually the case that people who interview me for the media have not read anything. I had a crazy experience recently. I was interviewed by a radio person, not from out here, who said, we get on air. It was a taped, actually, interview. And he said, the name of the book is Let There Be Water, Israel's Solution for a Water-Starved World. That's the name of the book. So we start the interview, and he says, so, Israel has lots of water problems, right? Tell us about it. So I said, this is being taped, right? So we can start from scratch all over again? He said, yeah. I said, can I go out on a limb and guess that you haven't actually read my book? So he's got a little bit of ego. He said, well, not all of it. So I said, did you get as far as the subtitle? He said, what do you mean? I said, do you have a copy of the book handy in the studio somewhere? He goes, yeah, it's right here. He goes, oh, yeah, let's start all over again. So I need Adam's introduction. I want to thank Adam for that beautiful introduction and unexpectedly lovely one. Thank you, Adam. And also I want to thank, if I can, the sponsors of this evening, and most particularly since everyone else has thanked Tal, I want to thank Tal also. It's not easy to attract a crowd, and you have done something remarkable to do so. So thank you very much. I want to tell you a little bit tonight about how I came to write this book. I want to tell you about what I learned in my journey. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a water person. As you heard in the introduction, I'm a business guy. I'm a lawyer. I've been interested in public policy for a very long time. And perhaps, like many of you in this audience, you know, those of you particularly who are undergraduates, when I was an undergraduate, I also went on a fairly regular basis to lectures with fairly obscure topics like this and found myself, for some crazy reason, interested in the subject matter. So perhaps I'll be able to do some of that with you tonight as well. But the story of how I came to write this book is a bit of a crazy one. And it also, for those of us who are sometimes feel trapped in where we are in life, it might be a nice sort of serendipitous model for all of us, that sometimes life's most joyful experiences come from an odd detour. So as Adam said in his introduction to me, I'm a member of a foreign policy think tank called the Council on Foreign Relations. And what the council does is it thinks about foreign policy concerns and issues and problems, usually not just what's going on currently, although there's some of that, but also things that are over the horizon, things that will be the problem tomorrow or years from now. And about 4+ years ago, before there was a lot of talk about the California drought, although everyone knew from time to time there were California water problems, but before it was part of certainly the consciousness on the East Coast, I attended this seminar with a title something like The Coming Global Water Crisis. Now, to just give a sense of how insignificant that subject was just a little more than 4 years ago, I go up to the council's headquarters on a beautiful townhouse on East 68th Street off of Park Avenue in Manhattan. They're offering, as part of this, a free lunch, right? Tonight you got a free book, so the big turnout. But they're offering a free lunch, which in New York City is more expensive than one of these books. And I figured that I'd have to elbow my way into the room when they announced it was free lunch. But lo and behold, I get there, and it's actually pretty sparsely attended. And the guy who's speaking is not some crazy environmentalist talking about the end of days as we know it, but rather, he's a rather sober individual, a retired U.S. Air Force general who now heads one of the 14, yes, there are 14, one of the 14 U.S. federal government intelligence agencies. We all know the CIA. It turns out that there are actually lots of federal intelligence agencies, and this one is the National Intelligence Council, and he heads a desk there on sort of coming global environmental threats, okay? Serious guy. And the reports of the National Intelligence Council are usually classified, top secret, and only for the president and for leaders of Congress. But occasionally they decide to declassify these reports and share them with a more general public, and as luck would have it, just 2 or 3 days before this meeting, this report had been declassified. And what he says in this presentation, this very sober, serious guy, what he says is that by the year 2025, which then seemed pretty far away, but now is pretty immediate, by the year 2025, he said 60% of the world's landmass will be experiencing significant water scarcity issues. That represents about 4 billion people worldwide out of a global population of 7.5 billion people. So that's a pretty significant and scary fact. I later found out there's another U.S. government report issued about the same time that says that 40 of our 50 U.S. states coincidentally, by the year 2025, will also be experiencing water scarcity. So it's not just one of these things like, oh, well, it's over there in some countries that, you know, I should know the names of, but I really don't, but what the hell? I live here, I don't live there, so why should I worry about it? So it's here, and it's there, and it's everywhere. But then this retired general goes on to explain to us that even if you are living in New York City, and I don't think there's going to be a scarcity of water in New York City anytime soon, unless, God forbid, there's a terror attack on our water supply. But what this general then says is that this is going to affect everybody everywhere because food prices are going to rise globally, number one. And number two, in places like New York City, we expect food prices to rise. That's just part of the life. But we don't expect it perhaps in countries where people are living on $1 or $2 a day. For them, it's not an inconvenience, it's life-changing. And so what he says is that what their expectations of the U.S. government is that this is going to foment social instability in many countries, including several countries which he would not name, but you can imagine which they are, including several countries which are significant or crucial to the U.S. defense profile around the world. Now, this is scary enough just by that. But then we start talking about and thinking about what this will mean if in places that have large population centers, the amount of water there gives out, what will the people do? It's not like, well, if you can't eat pizza, you'll eat falafel, or if you can't eat this, you'll eat that. Or if you can't use oil, you'll use natural gas, or you'll go without. You have to have water. So this raises the possibility that large numbers of people in countries like India or China or Brazil even, or Mexico, all of which have severe water problems on the verge of crisis, that we could face a situation where not 1 million or 2 million, but tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of people will have to pick up and move from where they are to where they hope they'll find adequate supplies of water. Now, he didn't talk about this 4 years ago because it hadn't yet occurred, but I just want to pause for a moment in my narrative and update the conversation. In the past few months, in the past 6 months, 8 months, a year at most, we've all seen exactly what the effect will be on the world if there is a significant migration of people who are leaving a place of distress to what they hope will be an island of stability, right? We saw this with the Syrian civil war refugees. Europe said they would welcome in a significant number of them, about 1 million, maybe 2 million. Now we're talking about Europe, wealthy, large geographically, about 400 million people. 1 million people coming in has created such mayhem and destabilization in the continent that it's led to the rise of right-wing parties in a number of countries, including countries like France, we expect some countries to have right-wing parties, but not France. That Germany, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, whenever it was, the election of Angela Merkel's party, she got drubbed over this immigration issue. That's over 1 million or 2 million people. And by the way, don't think there hasn't been an echo effect of that on our political conversation here. To a large degree, without me commenting on any one candidate or another, to a large degree, the appeal of certain of these candidates has been an appeal to the idea of we're going to block these bad guy immigrants from coming our way. So immigration at the 1 million or 2 million or 5 million level is destabilizing. What will this mean to the world if we face a world of enormous mass migration? Okay, so I leave this meeting, and I am alarmed. I'm alarmed because, number one, it's scary, and number two, because I regard myself as a well-informed citizen. I read serious journals, I follow the news very closely, and I thought to myself, how is it possible that this is the first time I have heard this story? Again, I've heard of droughts here and there. They come, they go. You weather it for a few years, cattle die. It's very tragic. There's always a story on 60 Minutes about some farmer who lost his grandfather's farm. Okay. It's very heartbreaking. But to be fair about it, it doesn't change the world. So I go back to my office and I say, I want to understand what this is about. Is this just about climate change? Is that what this is about? So I start reading up about this over the coming days. And what I discover is, of course, climate change is a factor in this. But there are other factors. For example, population growth, right? There are now, I mentioned before, 7.5 billion people in the world today. The best guesstimate is that in the next couple of decades, the world population will rise to 10 billion people or more. Now, if our water resources are pinched at 7.5 billion people, what in the world are we going to do when we rise to 10 billion people? So that's concern number one. Concern number two is that we are not just growing larger in population around the world, we are also growing more affluent around the world. Now, affluent, I'm not talking about Beverly Hills or the Upper West Side of Manhattan where I live. No, I'm talking about affluent like rising out of the most dire squalor of poverty into the bottom rungs of what, if there's an economics professor or two here, you might call the bottom rung of the middle class. And that bottom rung of the middle class doesn't mean vacations at Disneyland or Disney World per se, but what that does mean, or may mean, is that you start having a change of diet and you start using electricity. And the change of diet is the first concern. There are no doubt people in this room who are either vegetarians or vegans. But anyone here who is a vegetarian or vegan, or if there's no one here who is a vegetarian or vegan, you know somebody who is. But anybody who you know, or anyone here who is a vegetarian or vegan, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, you're not that because of economic necessity. You're a vegetarian or a vegan because of religious reasons or ethical reasons or maybe health reasons, but it's not because you can't afford a piece of chicken or a hamburger or something like that. Now, once you rise out of the squalor of poverty to the bottom rungs of the middle class and maybe higher, we're not talking about jacuzzis and swimming pools and green lawns. We're talking about you eating chicken and beef. And just to give the most gross example, and so I can move on, a pound of corn, and that's what poor people eat. They eat corn or they eat rice. A pound of corn versus a pound of beef, it takes 17 times more water to grow that pound of beef than it does to grow that pound of corn. And if that's the case, we better find a lot more water resources because the UN is estimating now that within 10 years of today, 1.2 billion of those 7.5 billion people in the world, 1.2 billion who are now living lives of squalor and poverty, are going to be out of that squalor and poverty. And there are many other reasons, but let's end the conversation with the third one, and that is climate change. All over the world, rain patterns are changing. Many places there's less rainfall. When rain doesn't have less volume, what is happening is that the intervals from rainfall number one, number two, and number three are becoming elongated. The soil, the dirt is becoming harder packed. When the rains come, it hits the earth like the earth is asphalt, and the ground doesn't absorb the water in the same way, and the water runs off. So we don't have the capacity for recharge, even in those places where there is the same amount of rainfall, or even in some places more rainfall. So this is a grave crisis. Now, I'm a business guy, and business people, at least the business people that I admire most, of course, note where there are problems, but we also think of what are solutions. And I started thinking, I'm an engaged citizen, I know elected officials, I care about these issues. What can I learn that I can share with others, that I can ask of them to become engaged to try to fix these problems. So I kept my reading going on. And here's what I learned. I learned something that shocked me, and I'm going to tell you why it shocked me. I have been to Israel quite a number of times. I didn't know anything about the environment of Israel per se, but I did know from my travels there, it's a small country, but that 60% of that country is desert. I didn't know the number, but I know a lot of it was desert. And I learned that in this process that the rest of the country is semi-arid. I didn't know then the exact numbers, but I knew it was a rapidly growing population. Remember we just talked about rapid population, affluence, and climate change? Well, Israel has the world's fastest rate of population rise in the world since 1948 when Israel achieved independence. A tenfold increase in its population during that time. And in fact, from 1948, May of 1948, when Israel declared independence, until late 1951, early 1952, Israel did something that no other country in history has done. It doubled in size. It took in refugees from Europe, from North Africa, from the Islamic world, Jews from all over the world, settled and resettled in Israel. And successive waves of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, from Yemen, from Ethiopia, have also come, so that Israel has had a rapid rise of population, number one. Number two, affluence. Other than Singapore and South Korea, Israel has had the most dynamic economy in the world since Israel's independence in 1948. It's had a 70-fold increase in its GDP in that time period. So I'm sitting looking for solutions, and I'm saying to myself, Israel must be cooked, but it isn't. In fact, what I discover is that Israel is not just self-sufficient in water. In the middle of the Middle East, which we all know is a water-starved region, Israel has a rapid rising population, which we know from this general's report and from what I'm reading, that population increase is going to cause part of the water problem. Israel's had an affluent and dynamic economy that continues to sizzle. And Israel, I also learned, has had climate change problems such that from 1948 till today, approximately 50% less average annual rainfall than it did just a few decades ago. So with all of those features, Israel should be among the worst and most troubled of all countries in the world, and yet it isn't. Israel is not just self-sufficient in water, Israel is positively abundant in water. It is so abundant in water that not only does it provide 24/7 safe water for all of its people, as if it was the city of London, or San Francisco, or San Luis Obispo, or New York City, it does something that actually only 700 to 800 million people in the world today have, which is anytime, 24/7, safe, healthy water to drink. Most of the world has rationed water. Even in the major cities of the world, they shut off the water system for most of the week, 5 or 6 days of the week, because the water systems are so broken, the infrastructure is so terrible, they shut the systems down so that it doesn't leak itself into oblivion. And so Israel somehow or other, with that fast population, that great economy, the bad climate change problem, has so much water that it provides water for its own people. It provides more than half of the water for the Palestinians in the West Bank. It provides water, not as much, but it provides water for the Palestinians in Gaza. And it also even provides that water in all times and all circumstances, even when rockets are flying out of Gaza, as was in the summer of 2014. And in addition, Israel provides a significant amount of water to the Kingdom of Jordan. And finally, and something that everyone in this audience will understand, because this is an agriculture-smart audience, Israel has developed a multi-billion-dollar agricultural export industry. And what really is agriculture other than value-added water? So only a country that is so secure in water, unless they're crazy, only a country that is so self-secure in water would allow itself to give away water to its neighbors, or to sell water to its neighbors, and to sell away its water in the form of fruits and vegetables. So I didn't think at first I would write a book about it. I had no thoughts I would write a book, but I thought this is an interesting model that I'd want to bring to policymakers. I got on a plane, I went to Israel, and instead of doing my usual trips to Israel, which is going to my 5 favorite hummus restaurants, what I did was instead, but can I ask, how many of you actually have been to Israel? Can I just see you in the audience, show of hands? Great. Okay. Not all of you. Sometimes I ask this question, every single hand goes up, and sometimes I ask this question and not a single hand goes up. So this is probably about the median point. So good. So I can pitch my comments appropriately. I won't assume you know very much, but I'll assume you know something. So I get on a plane, I go to Israel, and Israel's a very open society. It's a remarkable place. And for the purposes of this book, I interviewed 220 separate people, which is a lot of reporting. And I don't want to praise myself, but it's a lot of people to interview. And a lot of them I interviewed more than once, and all I did about 700 interviews, because I wanted to learn a 360-degree view of the water story of Israel. About 190 of them are Israelis, 20 of them were Palestinians, and 10 of them were U.S. government officials or heads of NGOs. And I want to tell you, I had no problem getting access to just about any of these people in Israel, including the president of Israel, Shimon Peres, gave me what was initially supposed to be a 15-minute interview, ended up being almost the entire morning he spent with me talking to me about water issues and the history of water in Israel. By contrast, I must say, my experience with getting American officials to speak to me, particularly on the record, was pure agony. I had to go through such bureaucracies that it's almost a metaphor for our water problems, why we have so many here and they have fixed theirs there. But that I'll save either for the Q&A or for another time. So anyway, I go off to Israel and I start interviewing people, and what I discover is that there's a very clear reason why Israel has figured this out. And let me start by saying this to you. Israel has had 3 great existential choices that it made. 3 great choices. And I want you to hear, when you take away from this evening, take away the key word is choices made. So the 3 great existential choices made by Israel. One of them, I'm sure you all know whether you can articulate or not. The second one may be less so, maybe those who raise their hands. And the third one, we'll see. Those who read my book for sure, but the rest maybe not. The first great existential choice Israel made, and all 3 of these were made in the 1930s. Israel was founded as a state in 1948, but it had a proto-government, a precursor to its government, that it began as part of the Zionist revolution decades before the state was founded. They started creating state-like institutions, universities, labor unions, trade associations, and other forms of self-governance that when finally the British made the decision to leave the Palestine Mandate in May of 1948, they were ready to sort of turn the switch and go from being Zionists to being Israelis. So the Zionists made 3 great decisions. The first great decision they make in the 1930s is this. They make the decision that they can't rely on others for their defense. They make the decision, doctrinally, they make the decision that they will defend themselves by themselves. Where they can have an ally or a weapons supplier, all the better, but they will defend themselves by themselves. And I hasten to add with great pain that they were very prescient, they were very foresighted in this, because we see what happened during the Holocaust. They make the decision in the mid-1930s that they will be prepared to defend themselves by themselves and not reliant upon the British or others to look out for them. And they build what becomes a great series of militias, which again, when the state is declared, becomes the Israeli army. And Israel, a country of only 8 million people, Israel today has one of the 3 or 4, or at worst 5 greatest militaries in the world, comparing itself to countries with 10 times and 20 times and 40 times as many people as Israel does. That's the first great existential choice they make, a choice made. You'll see where I'm going with this, I promise. The second great choice they make, again in the 1930s, is that they will build the world's greatest immigration absorption system, an immigration absorption system second to none anywhere in the world. And I hasten to add, once again, even in the year 2016, we might not learn just from Israel in water, we might actually learn from them something about how to absorb immigrants as well. They make this decision that they say that Israel will be a home, again by doctrine, Zionist doctrine. They refer to it as the ingathering of the exiles. The idea being that all the Jews around the world once was centered in what is then Palestine, and they were dispersed. They are now exiles, and the Zionist phraseologies will be the ingathering of the exiles. Take away the Zionist ideology, and the idea is that Jews, anywhere they live, whether in free lands like America or lands of despotism, these Jews will be welcomed into Israel. And so they build out an immigration absorption system that's capable of absorbing a large volume of immigrants, so large that, as I said before, they doubled in size in just 4 or 5 years. It's hard to do. And these were not just immigrants from one place. They came from more than 100 countries, 140 languages, different forms of religious observance. And they built a coherent, cohesive society around it. Okay, but the third great existential choice that they made, and this is significant, they make the decision in the 1930s that they will never allow scarcity of water. They will never allow a scarcity of water to stymie their growth as a society. All those immigrants that they're hoping to absorb will need jobs, and maybe they'll be farmers, because part of that Zionist ideology is the rebirth of the land, and the Zionists will build the land. They won't be just shopkeepers and merchants like they are in Europe and in North Africa. So they will have enough water for as many farmers who want to come, and they will make it certain for national security reasons and for pride reasons that they will be self-sufficient in fruits and vegetables and food for their people. And for that, you need lots of water. And they make the decision that they were going to figure this out. Now, this is forced on them in a very dynamic way that I speak about in my book, and I'll talk about briefly right now. In May of 1939, now the British are ruling the area under what's called the British Mandate, the area that today is Gaza, Israel, and the West Bank. The British are ruling other areas as well. They're ruling Iraq as a colony. They're ruling Transjordan. But they make a decision, the British say in May of 1939, that all Jewish immigration to Palestine, to the land of Israel, must stop. They allow a token number of Jews in under this decree called the White Paper. The reason they give, a false reason, by the way, I tell in my book the true reason, the false reason they give is that they say there's now 1.3 million people in the envelope of Gaza, West Bank, and Israel proper today. And the British are not planning on leaving in May of 1948 or any other time soon. They're writing in the Imperial Archives, which I found during my research. They're planning on staying for 300 years like they were in India. They weren't planning on leaving India. They're not planning on leaving Palestine. They need it as an essential trade route from Iraqi oil going to the port of Haifa and then on to England. And they're planning on staying. And they don't want to have more people there. And they say that we have to stop immigration. They claim, falsely, again, you'll see in the book why, they claim because we just simply don't have enough water. So the Zionist leadership now is in a state of alarm. First of all, because it's Zionist ideology to welcome Jews who want to come, but something second is happening. For those of you who know European history, May 39 is a very pregnant date. It's a midpoint of sorts between the beginning of World War II. Anyone know the date of the beginning of World War II? September 1st, 1939, and also something in the rearview mirror. November of 1938. Anybody win a free book? Anybody know what that is? Yeah, what? Kristallnacht is correct. Sir, you get a free book. So does everybody else. So I'm being like I'm a big shot here, you know. So, by the way, it's not an easy thing to be talking about the Holocaust and Kristallnacht and get an audience to laugh. So I want to thank you all for playing along with me. So, but who just said that, sir? You with the hat, right? Yeah. Okay. You see me afterwards. I'm going to give you an extra book. Okay. So, by the way, we can do audience participation all night long. Every one of you can get a book this way. So the Jews of Europe are in a panic. The Jews of Europe are desperate to get out. You know, sometimes people say our brothers and sisters overseas, you know, it's a figure of speech, our brothers and sisters. People don't really mean that. In this case, the Zionists left behind their mothers and fathers, their brothers and sisters, in some cases their children. They're desperate to get them out. And so what happens is the British do not relent, but in the meantime, the Zionists put their best mind to work on this. A man who Adam mentioned in the introduction, Simcha Blas, develops a water plan for the Zionists, which was so sophisticated that presented to the British and shows that they could absorb 4 million people almost immediately. 4 million, 6 million die in the Holocaust. And they represented to the British after the war breaks out because pockets of Europe are still able to have Jews come as refugees, and they represent it in 41 and in 42 and in 43 and even in the beginning of 1944 when it was possible to still save Hungarian Jewry. And every time the British say no. At the end of World War II, there's a brief period, and then comes the State of Israel's founding. And what the Zionists have is a bankrupt government, out of money, beleaguered on every border, armies invading, terrorism every day, called Fedayeen. Today it's, terrorists of a different name, but it's the same idea. But they had made these choices earlier. Remember I said the 3 existential choices? And bankrupt though they are welcoming everyone to the country. Bankrupt though they are building this great army. And bankrupt though they are, they make the choice to begin building out a great national water system. Now, I'll tell you, let me just slide over to the podium so I see how much time I've used up. Okay, very good. Okay, I know how much time I have left now. Okay, so, but you don't, so you have to stay with me. But I won't be that much longer. So let me tell you a little bit about what Israel did at that time. The first thing that they do is they understand that agriculture is the largest user of fresh water. Everybody knows that. State of California uses 78% of the fresh water of the state for agriculture. In most of the world, it's 70%. Most of the rest of the United States is 70%, but some third world countries like Egypt uses 90%, Ethiopia 90%, in Iran it's 95% of the fresh water is used for agriculture. And think about this. They say to themselves, if that's where the water is being used, we need to figure out a way to use less water for agriculture, or to use different water for agriculture. And so a couple of things start happening. First thing is, they realize that there's lots of brackish water, that's salty, minerally water that's underneath the desert sands. And they realize that most of the world thinks of this as a nuisance, useless water. But maybe, just maybe, it's usable. Now, in the 1930s, the head of the Palestinians in Jerusalem, his title was the Mufti of Jerusalem, he decreed in 1939 that any Arab farmer who sold seeds to a Jewish farmer would be executed. And because all of the Jewish farmers at that time were buying their seeds from what was a lucrative business for the Arab farmers, all the Jewish farmers were buying their seeds from the Arab farmers. This created a crisis for the Jewish farming called the kibbutz movement, these socialist farms, and also for private farms. And so the Jews quickly form a seed co-op. Now, around the same time, lots of scientists are coming, mostly from Europe, refugees, into the land of Israel. This is before the white paper. And they get put to work. They're not just breeding seeds to give seeds of every old kind to the farmers. The farmers are coming back to them and they're saying, do you think we could do something here to help us out with drought or bugs or other problems? And these scientists, is long before there's genetically modified seeds, long before GMO, these scientists get to work thinking about how they can modify seeds. And one of the great innovations they have is they develop a seed that is drought resistant. They develop a seed that thrives on salty, brackish water. They develop a series of plants that have shorter stalks that focus just on the fruit. And they have a revolution in agriculture. The second revolution in agriculture happens a few years later. That man, Simcha Blas, who I mentioned the Zionists turned to write this master plan, he became the water czar of Israel. He was the king of all water decisions, except in 1959, he does something quite foolish. He gets into a political dispute with the prime minister of the country, and you cannot win a fight with the head of the country, especially a popular head of country. And he then resigns on principle, assuming that, of course, the prime minister will see the foolishness of his ways of disputing the water genius who he was. And he goes home, a very poor man, he goes home to his 2-room apartment in Tel Aviv, not 2-bedroom, 2-room apartment in Tel Aviv. He's sitting there. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? He's 59 years old. If anybody here has ever been 59 years old and wondered what are you going to do with the rest of your life, use Simcha Blas as a model. Simcha Blas says, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And he remembers all of a sudden an extraordinary moment some decades earlier where he saw a row of trees, and one tree, all trees the same species, and one tree was much taller than the others. And he didn't know why. And he goes over to the base. He was at a farm drilling a well for a farmer. He goes over and starts kicking the soil. And right at the spot where he kicked, fate would have it that he saw a pipe that ran from the farmer's home, from a well to the farmer's home. And right at that spot, right at the root, kicks the dirt, and he sees a pinhole leak dribbling about an inch or two below the soil. And he realized that's probably why this one tree and this row of trees, same soil, same sunshine, same species, probably planted the same day, why this one tree is so much taller than the others. I've just told you the story of how drip irrigation gets born. 30 years later, Simcha Blas, sitting in his apartment, trying to figure out what he's going to do with the rest of his life, says to himself, I just wonder if maybe that tree could transform agriculture. And he spends the next couple of years developing drip irrigation, which it takes Israel by storm, and now has slowly begun to be permeated throughout the world. And I predict within a few years it'll be everywhere. I'll tell you a few of the tricks they use very quickly. Number one, in 1952, Israel decides that with all the water that they've developed, they still don't have enough, and they can see that in a couple of decades they're going to be really short of water. And what are they going to do? And so they come up with this idea, 1952. They come up with this idea that they have lots of sewage, and they're going to spend decades building a parallel national water infrastructure system. They're going to gather all the sewage, they're going to treat it to an ultra-high level so that you could drink it if you had to drink it, but no one's going to drink it. And they're going to pipe it down to the northern Negev desert to make the desert bloom with desert farms. And remarkably, that's exactly what they do. It takes them about 30 years to complete this project. And Israel is one of the few, if only, countries in the 20th century that ended the century with less desert land than it began it. And that's because Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, those of you who remember that name, promised he would make the desert bloom, and that was partially how he made the desert bloom. And the other great technology, which one that you all know about, is desalination. Ben-Gurion was a visionary. He talked again and again about the idea of desalting the sea so there could be water for everyone and everything. And in very, very early in the state's history, in the country's history, he makes the decision to allocate some resources to building a scientific bureau to figure out ways of desalting the sea at low prices. And that leads, after iteration after iteration, invention after invention, experiment after experiment, it leads to today, where the world's largest desalination plant is based a mile and a half off of Israel's shore. It's built as an inland desalination plant of seawater, and it produces, it's the largest volume desalination plant in the world. It produces the lowest cost desalinated water in the world, and it's the lowest carbon load of any carbon-based desalination plant in the world. I want to just say one more word about technology before I leave this area. What's extraordinary about Israel, and what I learned from my interviews and from my experience there, is also something that we can learn and admire. Not always, but largely. Utilities, not always, but largely. Farmers take the attitude of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Utilities get their rates set by a rate commission, and they are not given any incentives whatsoever for changing or mixing up or trying new big ideas. And farmers, not all of them, but many of them, say, this is what my grandfather did or my great-grandfather did, and if it was good enough for him, it's good enough for me. In Israel, it's exactly the opposite. Now, I mentioned to you that I had interviewed Shimon Peres, the just recently retired president of the state of Israel, a remarkable world figure. And Peres said to me in the course of our interview that Jews, he said, are never satisfied with anything. He says, and that's very, very good for science. And then he paused and he said, and very bad for politicians. And he talked about in the interview about how Israel on the kibbutz and on farms everywhere saw themselves as new men and new women. Their idea was, how could they transform not just themselves and their ancient homeland, but how could they transform science? And he said they tried all kinds of crazy experiments. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. And let me tell you how it actualizes itself today. I'll just give a small example. I talk about it at greater length in my book. Utilities. Israel has the second lowest rate of leaks nationally in their water system of any country in the world. How do they get there? They address it aggressively, but they don't dig up every street. They employ technology. Now, how do they come to this technology? Israel has a system that every one of the municipal utilities has an obligation to partner with a venture capitalist, with an entrepreneur who has some great new idea. Anybody here have a great idea they'd like to try it with? Anybody here who scientists have a great idea? Anybody know anybody who has a great idea? And they couldn't get their idea going because they couldn't find a partner they couldn't find the capital, they couldn't find someone to try it with, right? In Israel, the government provides 85% of the R&D budget for the first 2 years of all vetted, approved ideas not just in water, in other areas too, but particularly in water. And then that private company, is urged to partner with one of the many municipal utilities to try out their idea. When it works, it's rolled into in a second and a third and in all of the utilities. When it doesn't work, it dies. And when it really works well, that becomes a global company with global exports. It thrives the economy. It creates new classes of wealthy individuals. It improves the water profile of the country, and it helps create a water cluster inside of Israel. The same thing happens with farming. Farmers are also encouraged to do the same type of thing. And that kind of mindset, I would argue, as industrial policy, would be good for us here as well. I want to close, because I want to leave a lot of time, as much time as we can for Q&A. I want to close by talking about one final area. Water has been a source of conflict since time immemorial. We know back to the time of the Bible, and we know from other ancient scripts, that water has been a source of war and battle. I think that there's something else that we've learned now from Israel today, is that water can be a source of conflict, yes, and we've all heard the phrase that the wars of the 21st century will be fought over water, and maybe that's true, but I don't know that it has to be true. Because for Israel, water has not been a source of conflict, but a source of conflict resolution. And I want to tell you about some of the things that has happened. Some of the stories I tell in my book, which have never been reported before, and most of which I learned about by accident through my reporting and my interviewing all these people. First, everybody knows that Iran hates Israel, right? The Iranians despise Israel. But somehow or other, for about 20 years, Israel came to run the water sector of Iran. In 1962, Iran suffered a catastrophic earthquake which destroyed what is the equivalent of their San Joaquin Valley, the Qazavian district. It destroyed an ancient irrigation system, and the Shah of Iran knew that even in 1962, the young country of Israel had sophisticated and advanced water systems. And quietly, he reached out through intermediaries to ask Israel if they could send one or two or maybe three hydrologists to come and advise them on what to do with this water crisis. The three came actually almost immediately, and within a matter of a year or two, they were joined by not another dozen or 2 dozen, but by hundreds of hydrologists, geologists, mathematicians, statisticians, and other construction engineers who helped build out the national water economy of Iran. In 1979, the Shah falls, Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power, and the Israelis, in a scene almost like Argo, leave the country, that movie Argo. Some of the remaining Iranian engineers, water engineers, hydrologists who were trained by the Israelis are executed by the regime. Many others are exiled. It's a terrible tragedy. And you know who suffered most? The poor people of Iran. Today, Iran is thought to have perhaps the second worst water profile of any country in the world. Just as the book was going to press, I got a copy of an Iranian government report that I got translated from Farsi into English, which says that it's possible that as many as 50 million Iranians out of 84 million will have to be relocated within 10 years because water problems are so severe. Israel, though, for almost 20 years, used water as a tool of engagement and a pathway to peace with the Iranians. Second, China. China, for very many years, was an insecure power. They made a deal with the Islamic Conference that the Islamic Conference states, about 65 states, would vote with China at the UN, and the Islamic Conference asked for one thing in return: a complete and total boycott of Israel. No contact of any kind. But then the Chinese discovered that they had serious water problems. And so in secret, again, this has never been reported before, I met the people who did this. In secret, they brought in teams of Israeli hydrologists to help diagnose what their problems were and to come up with Israeli solutions. It's a crazy story. They had to ship the solutions to other countries, had to strip off all the Israeli markings, then had to ship it again to China, but be that as it may. But it helped China. And the Chinese came to understand that their water future would be tied to having the best of the best technology. And that leads directly to China breaking the deal with the Islamic Conference, inviting in the first Israeli to China is a hydrologist. For those of you who are hydrologists in this room, great to know that you are a pathway to peace. And within a year, China and Israel declared diplomatic relations are established. Today, 150 countries around the world buy Israeli water technology. And the reason why that number 150 is a significant number is that there are not 150 countries around the world that have diplomatic or commercial relations with Israel. So that means that on a, if not daily basis, then a regular basis, Israeli businessmen and businesswomen carrying an Israeli passport with prior arrangement are flying into countries that at the United Nations and in other bodies are busily condemning Israel and saying vile things about Israel. They're welcoming Israelis who can help them solve their water problems. And you know what? Some people have said to me, when I mention this story, they've said to me, I would let them die of thirst. I think the opposite. I think, first of all, it's a beautiful thing to help people everywhere they could be helped. But second of all, maybe one of these countries is the next China that will decide, you know what? There's a great opportunity. We're going to have diplomatic relations with Israel once again. And the third example I want to give is the Palestinians. It's probably the subject matter of Israel that most of us hear about from the media. From our experience, we hear about Israel and the Palestinians. And so I'm not going to pretend, not for a second, that everything is peachy between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But I want to give you another perspective that I heard not from the mouths of Israelis alone, but also from many, if not all, of the 20 Palestinians that I interviewed. And that is that, yes, there are problems between the Palestinians and the Israelis, but virtually from the first days of their engagement together since June of 1967, Palestinians and Israelis have found ways to work together day in and day out to create a better water future for the Palestinian people. In fact, in June of 1967, when Israel conquered the West Bank, there are 704 cities, towns, and villages in the West Bank. In June of 67, all of four had running water, representing 9% of the West Bank. Today, 97% of the West Bank 97% of the population of the West Bank, which has quadrupled, now has running water. So Israel has found a way with the Palestinians to engage over water and to create a pathway, if not peace, of coexistence and cooperation and dialogue. And I think for those of us who care about water issues, water is not just water. Water sometimes is a great deal more than that. And perhaps, just perhaps, the Israeli example can be an example to countries all over the world. Thank you very much.